The class roster arrived in my inbox on the Thursday before school started. The way it always does, a PDF attachment, 23 names in alphabetical order. The kind of document I have opened at the beginning of every school year for 9 years without it meaning anything beyond a list of students I had not yet met. I was eating lunch at my desk when I opened it. I scrolled through the names the way I always scroll through rosters, looking for nothing in particular, just getting the shape of the group in my head before the first day. And then I stopped. Lily Hartley. I sat very still with my sandwich halfway to my mouth, and I read the name again. Then I put the sandwich down. Then I read it a third time. Lily Hartley? I had spent 12 years trying not to think about that name. And here it was in a PDF attachment on a Thursday afternoon in August, third from the top in the H section, in the same font as every other name on the list. I closed the laptop. I sat in my classroom in the particular silence of a school building in late August, when the halls are still empty and the desks are still clean, and I thought about a hospital room in January 16 years ago and a bracelet I had put on a wrist that was smaller than my palm. Then I open the laptop and I read the name again. Lily Hartley. Welcome back to Still Standing Stories, where the women who made the hardest choices of their lives finally get to tell what came after. There is something I have not told you yet about the months after the semester ended, and I want to tell you now because it is the part of the story that is hardest to describe and also the most important. After I received Lily's letter and wrote back and began the slow, careful process of being in contact with her, I experienced something I had not anticipated, which was the particular difficulty of not knowing what role I was. I was not her mother in any functional sense. She had parents who were her parents, who had been present for every significant thing in her life, who knew her in the specific and unrepeatable way that presence creates. I was also not simply a stranger, or a biological fact, or a piece of her history. I was something that did not have a name I could find in the available vocabulary, which is itself a kind of difficulty. She wrote to me twice in the spring, letters. Both of them, she seemed to prefer letters, which I found remarkable and also consistent with everything I had observed about her in the classroom. Her second letter said, "I've been thinking about what to call this. I don't mean what to call you, I mean what this is." I looked up the word origin, and one of the definitions is the point at which something comes into existence. I think that might be it. You're my origin. You're not my mom. But you're where I started. You're where I started. I wrote back and told her that was the most precise and generous thing anyone had ever said to me, and that I was going to hold on to it for the rest of my life. She wrote back 2 weeks later with a question about a book she was reading, which felt like exactly the right thing to be asked, and I answered it at length, and we have been doing a version of that since. Occasional letters, occasional questions about books, the slow accumulation of knowing someone across a distance that is being carefully managed by both of us. I told my mother about the letters in April. We were having dinner at her house, and I showed her Lily's second letter, the one about the word origin. My mother read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "You made the right choice. Not the one 16 years ago. This one, the one in September, to stay in the class and be her teacher and give her the semester before she knew." I said I wasn't sure it was the right choice. She said, "I know that's how you know it was." I have thought about that a great deal since she said it. The relationship between certainty and rightness, which is not always the relationship we are taught to expect. The decisions that feel most clear in retrospect are often the ones that felt most impossible in the moment. The opposite is also sometimes true. But in this case, in the case of September through December, in the case of 22 students and a roster in a PDF attachment and a bracelet on a wrist in the second row, I think my mother was right. I also want to say something about what teaching means to me now, after this year, because it means something different than it did in August, and I think the difference is worth naming. I have spent 9 years believing that teaching is about the students in front of you. I still believe that, but I understand it differently now. I understand that the students in front of you are also sometimes people you are connected to in ways you cannot predict, and that the connection is not what makes the teaching matter. The teaching matters on its own terms. For its own reasons, for Marcus and Priya and the boy in the back who said books are people talking to you across time. The connection is separate from the teaching, and it does not justify it, and it does not explain it. It is simply something that happened in the same classroom where the teaching was also happening, and both things were real and both things mattered, and they did not have to compete. I go back to school in September. I have a new roster. In the H section, there is no one I recognize. And this fall, I will teach the way I always teach, with full attention, with the belief that language matters and that every student in my room is capable of something they do not yet know they can do. I will think about Lily sometimes, when a student writes something that surprises me, when the quality of attention in a room shifts into something genuine. But I will also think about Marcus and Priya and everyone else, because they are also real and also mine to teach and also capable of the things they do not yet know they can do. That is the job. It has always been the job. And it is enough. I want to tell you one last thing, which happened in May of this year, 6 months after the semester ended. I was grading papers at my desk after school, the kind of late afternoon grading that happens when the building has gone quiet, and the light through the windows has turned the specific amber color it turns in Nashville in May, and there was a knock at my classroom door. I said, "Come in." The door opened. Lily stood in the doorway. She was not in my class. She had no official reason to be in my building after hours. She was wearing a yellow jacket I had not seen before, and her hair was down, and she stood in the doorway with the particular posture of someone who has made a decision and is now standing in the moment of having made it. I said, "Lily," she said, "I wanted to see the classroom. Is that okay?" I said, "Of course." She walked in. She looked around at the bookshelves, at the student work on the walls, at the reading nook in the corner that I had built out of 2 armchairs and a rug and a small lamp. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, which was almost empty. She stood there for a moment. Then she turned around and looked at me. She said, "I sat right there." She pointed to the second row from the left, third seat from the front. "All semester?" I said, "I know." She said, "Were you scared?" I said, "Every single day." She nodded slowly. She looked at the seat for another moment. Then she looked back at me. She said, "I'm glad you didn't say anything. I needed the time." I said, "I know, that's why I didn't." She said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because you wrote about needing time in the essay. You wrote about wanting her to know you were okay. You didn't write about wanting to meet her." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know you read it that way." I said, "I read everything you write very carefully." She laughed at that, a real laugh, quick and surprised, and for a second she was just a 16-year-old in a yellow jacket laughing in an empty classroom, and I was just a teacher at her desk, and none of the rest of it existed. Then she said, "I should go. I told my mom I'd be home by 6. I said, "Tell her I said hello." She looked at me for a second, a considering look, the same considering look she gave texts in discussion before she decided what to say about them. Then she said, "I will." She walked to the door. She stopped in the doorway and turned back. "Ms. Morrison." "Yes. Thank you for teaching us. The whole class, not just me." I said, "That's all I was ever doing." She nodded. Then she left. I sat in the amber light for a while. Outside the parking lot was quiet. Inside my classroom, the students' work was still on the walls, 23 names, 23 voices, 23 different things they had learned this semester that had not been on the syllabus. In the second row from the left, third seat from the front, there was a small silver bracelet of light on the floor, a reflection from the window, from something outside catching the late sun. It lasted about 30 seconds, and then the light shifted, and it was gone. I went back to grading. If you have ever made a decision you could not undo and spent years wondering what it cost the person on the other side of it, this story is for you. Subscribe before you keep going, because what happened in my classroom over the course of one school year is something I have never told anyone in full, and I need you to hear all of it. My name is Kate Morrison. I am 35 years old, and I have been teaching English at Riverside High School in Nashville, Tennessee for 9 years. I teach 10th and 11th grade, and I am, by most measures, good at my job. I know how to reach students who have decided they are not readers. I know how to find the thing a student cares about and use it as a door into the work. I have been told by former students, in the cards they sometimes send years later, that my class was the one that mattered. I do not say this to build myself up. I say it because it is the context for everything that follows, and because the question of whether I'm good at my job is one I had to ask myself very differently in the fall of my 9th year of teaching. I was 19 years old when I found out I was pregnant. I was a sophomore in college, studying education, working 20 hours a week at a coffee shop to cover the gap between my financial aid and my actual expenses. The father was a junior named Derek who told me, when I showed him the test, that he was not in a position to be a father and that he hoped I understood. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, with the particular steadiness of someone who has prepared for one specific conversation and is relieved to be having it. I said I understood. He left. I sat in the parking lot of a CVS for 40 minutes. Then I drove back to my dorm and called my mother. My mother's response was not what I had hoped for and exactly what I had feared. She was a practical woman who had raised me alone after my father left when I was 7. And her practicality had always been the thing I most relied on and most resented about her simultaneously. She said, "You cannot raise a child on a college student's income without a father." She said it not unkindly, but with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had already done the math. She said, "You need to think seriously about adoption." Then she said she would support whatever I decided, which was true, and also irrelevant because she had already told me what she thought the decision should be. I spent 2 months thinking seriously about adoption, which meant 2 months of lying awake in my dorm room, running calculations that never came out the same way twice. I had no money, I had no partner. I had a mother who lived 300 miles away and a father I hadn't spoken to in 11 years. I had 2 more years of school, and a career that required those 2 years. I had a child growing inside me who had not asked for any of the circumstances she was being born into. I want to be honest about those 2 months because I think the honest version is the only one worth telling. I was not at peace with the decision. I did not arrive at it through a calm and rational process of weighing options. I arrived at it the way you arrive at the only door in a room, not because it is the door you would have chosen if you had been given a choice about the room, but because it was the only exit available from where I was standing. And I walked through it because the alternative was standing in that room forever. And I was 19 years old and I did not know how to do that. The agency I worked with was called New Horizons, and they specialized in open adoptions, which was the thing that made it possible for me to do it at all. Open adoption meant that the adoptive family agreed to maintain contact, letters, photographs, visits, if everyone was comfortable. It meant that my daughter would know she was adopted. It meant that I would not simply disappear from her life and become a silence that she spent her whole childhood trying to understand. The Hartleys were the third family the agency showed me. James Hartley was a high school history teacher. Susan Hartley was a pediatric occupational therapist. They had been trying to have children for 6 years. They lived in a house with a yard in a suburb of Nashville, the same city I was in, which felt significant at the time, like a sign that the geography at least was right. They came to meet me at the agency's office on a Saturday in November, and they were warm and specific, and they asked me questions about myself, rather than just about the baby, and Susan cried when she talked about what becoming a mother meant to her. And I thought, these are the people. We signed the open adoption agreement in December. I was 7 months pregnant. The agreement specified letters and photographs at minimum twice a year, phone calls if all parties were comfortable, and the possibility of visits as Lily grew older and as everyone's comfort with the arrangement evolved. James and Susan both signed it. I signed it. The agency representative witnessed it. It was not legally enforceable in the state of Tennessee. Open adoption agreements are not legally binding in most states, which is something I did not understand clearly at the time and which I have thought about many times since. Lily was born on January 14th. The labor was long. I was alone for most of it. My mother had driven up and was in the waiting room, but she did not come into the delivery room because I had not asked her to and she had not offered. A nurse named Patricia stayed with me through most of it, a quiet woman in her 50s who held my hand during the hardest parts and did not try to fill the silence with reassurance, which was the right choice and which I have never forgotten. When they put Lily in my arms, she was so small that I could not believe she was real. She had dark hair, more than I expected, and her eyes were not yet focused, but they were open. And she was looking in the direction of my face with the blind attention of a person who is trying to locate something important in an unfamiliar place. I held her for 2 hours. I want to be clear about this. I was not supposed to hold her that long. The plan I had agreed to was a brief holding and then the transfer to the Hartleys, who were in the hospital. But the nurse Patricia did not come to take her after 30 minutes, and I understood that this was a choice she was making on my behalf, and I did not call for her. I had bought a bracelet at a craft fair the month before. Small silver with a single letter L on a tiny charm. I had bought it without fully knowing why, or without being willing to fully know why, the way you do things when the honest reason is too large to look at directly. I put it on her wrist in the hospital room. It was loose, too loose, really for a newborn, but I adjusted it as small as it would go. Then I kissed her forehead. Then I pressed the call button. Patricia came in. She looked at me. I nodded. She took Lily out of my arms. I want to tell you what I did after that, because I think people imagine that the mother who places a child for adoption either goes home and grieves dramatically, or goes home and feels relieved and moves on, and the truth is neither of those things. I went back to my dorm room and I sat on my bed and I looked at the wall for a very long time, and what I felt was not grief exactly and not relief exactly, but something that had no name I could locate. A specific hollow silence, as though a sound that had been present for 7 months had stopped, and my whole body was still oriented toward the sound even though it was gone. I called my mother. She drove up the next day. She took me to dinner, and she was kind, and she did not say anything about the decision being the right one, which I had been afraid she would do. We talked about other things. I went back to class the following week. I finished the semester. I finished college. I got my teaching certificate. I moved back to Nashville. The Hartleys sent the first letter, and photographs 3 months after Lily was born. She was round and healthy in the photographs. Dark-haired still, looking at the camera with the serious attention of a baby who is taking in everything. Susan wrote warmly about how Lily was growing, about her temperament, about how James had started singing to her every night, and she seemed to settle when he did. I wrote back. I thanked them. I sent a small gift, a soft book with photographs of animals, the kind that babies can touch and feel. The second letter came 6 months later. More photographs. Lily sitting up for the first time, clearly proud of herself, the expression unmistakable even in a still image. I wrote back again. The third letter never came. I waited 4 months, which I thought was generous, which was not generous, which was simply me not wanting to be the person who demanded things from the family that was raising my daughter. I sent a short note to the address I had for them. No response. I sent an email to the address Susan had given me at our first meeting. No response. I called the agency. The agency said they would reach out to the Hartleys on my behalf. 3 weeks later, the agency told me the Hartleys had said they needed some space to focus on their family and would be in touch when they were ready. They were never ready. Lily was 3 years old the last time I had any contact with the family that was raising her, and that contact was the agency's relay of a message that told me to wait, and I had been waiting ever since. If you have ever been told to wait by someone who never intended to let you stop waiting, subscribe and stay with me, because what I did with those 12 years of waiting is the foundation of everything that happened when Lily Hartley walked into my classroom. I want to tell you about the 9 years of teaching that preceded that September, because they are the context without which the semester with Lily makes a different kind of sense, and because I think the story of a person who makes a life-altering decision at 19 and then builds something real in the years that follow deserves to be told with the same care as the dramatic parts. I came to teaching through the specific path of someone who needed the work to mean something, which is a different path than the one that comes through a straightforward love of children, or a family tradition, or a particular teacher who inspired you. I chose education at 18 because I wanted to do something that mattered, which is a vague and not especially useful reason, And I stayed in it after Lily because I needed to be somewhere that required my full attention for significant portions of the day. And teaching is nothing if not that. The first year was the hardest year professionally that I have experienced, including the year Lily walked into my classroom. The first year is hard for every teacher, and the specific difficulty is the gap between what you understood about teaching from the outside and what it actually requires on the inside. The sheer quantity of decisions made in real time. The management of a room full of people who did not choose to be there and who have varying degrees of interest in the material you are responsible for making interesting. I cried in my car on 3 separate Fridays in the fall semester of my first year. I called my mother twice to say, I did not think I was cut out for it. My mother said, "You are exactly cut out for it. You are in the part where being cut out for it doesn't feel like anything yet." She was right, as she usually was. By my third year, I had found the rhythm. By my fifth, I had found the thing I was specifically good at, which was the students who had decided they were not readers or writers. The ones who had been told, either explicitly or through years of indifferent grades, that language was not their thing. I had a particular interest in those students, because I understood the experience of being told implicitly that something essential was not available to you. And because the moment when a student discovers it is available to them, after all, is the moment I returned to teaching for every time it got difficult. Lily was not one of those students. Lily had always been a reader. I could see it in the way she held a book, in the way she annotated as she went, in the discussions where she referenced specific passages, rather than general impressions. She was the kind of student who makes a teacher's job feel like something other than work, which is its own category of gift. I want to tell you about October, the month that was in some ways harder than September, because October was when she started to become real to me in a way that went beyond recognition. In October, we read a short story collection, contemporary writers of various backgrounds, the kind of collection I had designed the unit around specifically because I believed students needed to see that literature was not a closed archive, but an ongoing conversation. One of the stories was about a woman who returns to a place from her past and finds it changed beyond recognition, which was not the theme I had chosen it for. I had chosen it for the prose style, but which became the theme of the discussion, because that is what students do. They find the thing that matters to them in a text, regardless of what the teacher intended. Lily said in the discussion, "I think the hardest part is when a place you've imagined looks different from the way you imagined it, because then you realize the version in your head was never real. It was just yours." The class talked about the story. I asked follow-up questions. The discussion moved on. I thought about what she said for the rest of the day. She was talking about the story. She was also, without knowing it, talking about something else. The imagined place that was never real. The version in your head. The gap between the thing you carry internally and the thing that actually exists. I understood exactly what she meant. I had been living in that gap for 12 years. I also want to tell you about the students who were not Lily, because teaching a class of 23 means that 22 other people are present in the room, and they deserve attention, and I gave it to them, and the giving of it was one of the things that kept me functional through a semester that was, in many ways, the most demanding of my professional life. There was a boy named Marcus who read everything but could not organize a paragraph to save his life. His ideas were brilliant, and they arrived on the page in the order they occurred to him, rather than in the order they needed to be in for a reader to follow them. We worked on this all semester, and by December he had produced 2 essays that were genuinely good, and he came to office hours regularly, and we talked about how organization was actually an act of consideration for the reader, and I watched him internalize that idea and start to use it. Marcus is the reason I became a teacher. Not Lily Marcus. There was a girl named Priya who wrote beautifully but who was terrified to share her work, who submitted everything at the last possible second as though proximity to the deadline reduced the risk of exposure. We worked on that too. Slowly, and by November she was reading a paragraph of her own work aloud in class, with the shaking voice of someone doing something that costs something, and the class listened with the specific respect that students give to genuine courage, and I thought, this is the job. I'm telling you about Marcus and Priya because I want you to understand that the semester with Lily was not only about Lily. It was also about teaching English to 23 10th graders who had their own specific intelligences and fears and capacities, and I gave each of them what I would have given them if none of the rest of it were happening. That was the commitment I had made when I chose to stay in the class, and I kept it. I want to tell you what those 12 years looked like, because I think the story of a mother who places a child and then gets on with her life sounds simpler from the outside than it is from the inside, and I want to be precise about it. I finished my degree and got my certificate and got my first teaching job at 23, and I was from the outside, a person who had made a difficult decision and handled it with maturity and moved forward. This is what people said to me when they knew, which was not many people. My mother, my closest friend from college, 2 colleagues I had told in moments of trust over the years. They said, "You did the right thing." They said, "You were so young." They said, "She has a good family." They said all of the things that were meant to be reassuring, and that were sometimes reassuring, and that were also, sometimes, the wrong shape for the specific thing I was carrying. What I was carrying was not guilt, or not only guilt, it was the open question. The question that had no answer available to me, which was, who is she now? It is one thing to make a decision when a person is an infant and you can tell yourself that the person does not yet exist in the full sense, that you're making a decision about potential, rather than about someone already formed. It is another thing to carry that decision for 12 years, while the potential becomes a person, and the person becomes whoever she is, and to have no access to the answer to the simplest question, who did she become? I thought about her on her birthdays, which is the thing everyone knows about, but I also thought about her in the small unannounced moments. When I read a book with a character I thought she might like, when a student in my class said something that reminded me of the way babies look when they are working something out. When a song came on the radio that I had listened to while I was pregnant in the dorm room in the months before January, these moments arrived without warning and they cost something, and I absorbed the cost and moved on because that is what you do when the alternative is not moving on. I dated. I had 2 serious relationships in my late 20s, both of which ended for reasons that were not directly related to Lily, and that were also, if I'm being honest, not entirely unrelated to her either. There is a specific way that an unresolved thing can make it hard to be fully present in a life, and I was not always fully present. I was sometimes partly elsewhere, in a suburb of Nashville where a girl was growing up without knowing that one of her teachers had put a bracelet on her wrist 16 years ago. I did not look for her. I want to be clear about this because I think it is important. I did not search for her, did not try to circumvent the adoption, did not attempt to make contact outside of the official channels I had been told were the appropriate ones. This was a choice, and it was not an easy one, and the reason I made it was that I believed, I had to believe, or the alternative was unbearable, that she was in a good home with parents who loved her, and that my inserting myself into her life without her knowledge or her consent would be about my need and not about hers. I was her mother. I had made a choice that was supposed to be about her best interests. I was not willing to undermine that choice by making everything about my own grief. So I did not look, I taught my classes. I read her a birthday in my head every January 14th. I carried the open question and I did not try to force an answer. And then September came, and with it a PDF attachment. And in the H section, third from the top, Lily Hartley. The first day of school I arrived 40 minutes early, and I rearranged the desks twice and rearranged them back again, because the arrangement didn't matter and I needed to do something with my hands. I had spent the 4 days between opening the roster and the first day of school in a state that I can only describe as a suspension, not panic, not anticipation exactly, but the specific quality of waiting that happens when you know something is coming and your body has gone ahead of your mind in understanding what it means. I had thought about what I would do. I had thought about it very carefully and from several angles. I could go to the administration and ask to have Lily transferred out of my class. I could do this without explaining why, since teachers occasionally have legitimate reasons for not working with particular students. This would protect both of us from a situation that I did not know how to navigate and that she did not know existed. I could go to the administration and explain why, which would mean telling a story I had kept private for 12 years, and which would immediately change my relationship to everyone who heard it, and would likely result in Lily being told things about herself that should not come from a school administrator. I could say nothing and teach the class and see what happened. I chose the third option. Not because it was the most comfortable, it was the least comfortable, but because any alternative required making decisions about Lily's life without Lily's knowledge, And I had already done that once, and the consequence of that first decision was still unfolding, and I was not willing to make another one. I chose to be her teacher. I chose to give her the best 10th grade English class I was capable of giving. And I chose to wait, again, and to let whatever was supposed to happen happen. She came in with a third group of students, talking to a girl beside her about something that had happened over the summer. I caught the words in the lake, and it was so cold, and she was laughing. And then she sat in the second row from the left, third seat from the front, and she opened her notebook and she looked up at the board where I had written the day's agenda. And I looked at her face. I had known I would recognize her. I had told myself I might not. 12 years is a long time. Babies change completely. I had been working from photographs that stopped coming when she was 3. I had told myself that the woman I was looking for might not be visible in the teenager in front of me. I had believed this partly, and had not believed it entirely. She had my grandmother's hands. That was the first thing I saw. The long fingers, the way she held the pen, the specific angle of the wrist. My grandmother had been a pianist, and her hands had been the thing everyone remarked on, and I had inherited them, and now I was looking at them on a 15-year-old girl in the second row who did not know I existed. She also had the dark hair from the hospital, longer now, and pulled back in a way that reminded me of something I could not immediately place. She was tall, taller than I had been at her age. She had a quality of attention that I noticed immediately, the quality of a student who is actually present, who is listening rather than waiting for class to end. She did not look like me in the way that people look for in these situations, the dramatic mirror image recognition. She looked like herself, which was its own kind of recognition. The recognition of a person you have been trying to imagine for 12 years finally becoming visible in 3 dimensions. I said good morning to the class. I introduced myself. I explained what we would be studying. I called roll. When I got to her name, Lily Hartley, she said here in a clear, unself-conscious voice. And I said thank you and moved to the next name. And I did not let anything show. And it cost me something to not let anything show that I'm still paying. The first month was the hardest. Not because anything dramatic happened, nothing dramatic happened. She was a good student. She did the reading. She contributed to discussion with the particular careful specificity of someone who has thought about the text before coming to class, and is not simply performing thinking in real time. She wrote well, clear sentences, strong instincts, the occasional image that was better than she probably knew it was. I graded her work the way I graded everyone's work. I called on her at the same frequency I called on other students. I did not avoid her, and I did not seek her out. I was her teacher. That was the role I had chosen, and I played it with everything I had. What I could not control was the bracelet. She wore it every day. The same bracelet, I was certain it was the same one, because it was silver and small and the L charm was visible when she pushed up her sleeve, which she did habitually when she was working through something on paper. I had not expected the bracelet to still exist. I had put it on a newborn's wrist 16 years ago at a craft fair, and I had imagined it long since lost, or outgrown or thrown away. But there it was, every day on her left wrist, and every day I saw it, and something in my chest did a specific thing that I have no better word for than recognition. She did not know what the bracelet meant. She could not have known. She had been 3 years old the last time the Hartleys had any contact with me, and there was no reason to think they had told her anything about the circumstances of the bracelet's origin. She wore it because she wore it, because it had been on her wrist long enough to become part of the landscape of her own body, the way objects become part of you when you have had them long enough. October, November. The year moved with the pace that school years have, fast in some ways, slow in others, marked by the rhythm of assignments and assessments and the gradual accumulation of trust between a teacher and a class that comes from spending an hour together 5 days a week. She came to my office hours twice, once to ask about an essay she was struggling with. The prompt was about the relationship between setting and character in the novel we were reading, and she had a strong instinct about the answer but was having trouble organizing it on the page. We talked for 20 minutes. She was quick. She took notes. She left and turned in an essay that was significantly better than her first draft, which is what office hours are supposed to produce. The second time she came in was harder. She sat down across from my desk and she said she was working on the personal essay unit, the assignment where students wrote about a person or experience that had shaped them, and she wanted to ask me something. She said, "Is it okay if the person I write about is someone I've never met?" I said, "Of course. What made you want to write about someone you've never met?" She said, "I'm adopted. I've always known that. My parents told me when I was really young, and I've been thinking about my biological mother lately. Not in a bad way, I just think about her sometimes." I held her gaze. My hands were flat on the desk. I said, "That sounds like a meaningful thing to write about." She said, "I just don't want it to seem like I'm being ungrateful for my parents. I love my parents, but I think about her. I wonder what she's like." I said, "Writing about wondering is some of the most honest writing there is. You should write exactly what you just said." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Thanks, Miss Morrison," and she left. I sat in my office for 20 minutes after she left. I sat with my hands flat on the desk, and I breathed and I did not cry, because crying was not something I was going to do in my office at school. And because the thing I was feeling was too large for crying anyway. It was too large for any of the containers I had available. She wondered what I was like. She had been wondering about me. She was 15 years old, and she thought about me sometimes, and she had just told me so. And she did not know she had told me so. And I had sat across from her and listened and said the truest thing I could without telling her anything she was not ready to know. Stay with me, because the personal essay she turned in 6 weeks later is something I want to read to you. I want to tell you about December, which was the month the semester ended, and which was also the month I met the Hartleys, and which contained something I have not yet described that happened in the classroom on the last day before winter break. It is a tradition in my class that on the last day of the semester, I read aloud to the students, not from anything on the syllabus, from something I have chosen specifically for the end of the year, something I think they are ready to hear that they might not have been ready to hear in September. Different classes get different texts. I choose based on what I have learned about a class over the course of the semester, about what they need to hear. For this class, I chose a short piece of prose by a writer named Marilynne Robinson, about what it means to be a stranger to someone who is not a stranger to you. It is a dense piece, not easy, the kind of writing that requires you to hold multiple meanings simultaneously, and I read it slowly. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment in the way that rooms go quiet after something that has taken up the available space. Then I said, as I always do on the last day, "Tell me one thing you learned this semester that wasn't on the syllabus." Students said various things. Marcus said he learned that a paragraph is a conversation with a reader. Priya said she learned that being afraid of something and doing it anyway are not mutually exclusive. A boy in the back said he learned that books are just people talking to you from across time, which was not something I had said, but which I was going to steal. Then Lily raised her hand. I called on her. She said, "I learned that the things you write when you're not sure anyone will understand them are sometimes the things that matter most to say." I looked at her. She was looking back at me with the clear, direct gaze she had when she was sure of something. I said, "That's exactly right." And I meant it about the writing, and I also meant it about everything else, and she did not know the everything else, but the writing part was true, regardless. Class ended. Students collected their things. Several of them said happy holidays, see you next year. Lily was one of the last to leave. She stopped at the door and turned back and said, "Thanks for the class, Miss Morrison. It was my favorite this semester." I said it was my favorite too. She smiled and walked out. I sat in my empty classroom for 20 minutes after the last student left. Then I got my things and went home, and I called my mother and I talked for an hour and a half about everything except Lily, because everything except Lily was what I needed to talk about. And my mother understood this without being told. In her words, because she wrote it better than I could describe it, and because it is the thing that changed everything about what happened next. The personal essay unit ran for 3 weeks. Students submitted drafts, received feedback, revised, submitted final versions. Lily's final version came in on a Wednesday afternoon through the digital submission portal, the same way every other student's did. I read 22 essays before I got to hers. I read them the way I always read student writing, carefully, with attention to what the student was trying to do as well as what they were actually doing. I made notes. I thought about each one. Then I opened Lily's. The essay was called The Woman Who Chose. It was 4 pages. She had clearly revised it significantly from her first draft. The prose was tighter than her usual work. More deliberate, the kind of writing that comes from someone who has gone back to a piece multiple times because it matters. She wrote about being told she was adopted at age 5, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. She wrote about her parents' faces as they told her. Careful, loving, watching her for her reaction. She wrote about the feeling of the information settling over her slowly, like weather coming in, not immediately comprehensible but clearly significant. She wrote about being 8 and searching her own face in the mirror for evidence of the woman she had come from. She wrote about the bracelet, which her mother had told her had been left by her biological mother in the hospital. She had been told that much, that it had been a gift from the woman who gave birth to her, and she had worn it since she was old enough to wear jewelry without losing it. Then she wrote about what she imagined when she thought about her biological mother. She imagined someone who had been afraid. She imagined someone very young. She imagined someone who had made the hardest choice she could imagine making, not because she didn't love the baby, but because love is not always the same thing as the right circumstances. She wrote, "I think she loved me before she knew me. I think she loves me still, in whatever way you can love someone you cannot find." I stopped reading at that line. I read it again, then I read it a third time. I think she loves me still, in whatever way you can love someone you cannot find. I finished the essay. The last paragraph was about what she wanted for her biological mother, not contact, not a dramatic reunion, just the knowledge that things had turned out okay. She wrote, "I want her to know I'm all right. I want her to know that I think about her without pain. I want her to know that the bracelet is still on my wrist." I put the laptop down. I walked to the window of my classroom. Outside it was November, gray and cold, the trees bare, the parking lot half empty. I stood at the window for a long time. I think she loves me still. She was right. She was 15 years old and she had written 4 pages about a woman she had never met, and every word of it was right. I graded the essay that night. I gave it an A, which it deserved on its own merits, independent of anything else. I wrote comments in the margins the way I always wrote comments, specific, about the craft, about what was working and what could be stronger. I said the line, "I think she loves me still, in whatever way you can love someone you cannot find," was the best sentence in the essay and possibly the best sentence she had written all year. I did not write anything else. I did not break the anonymity of her not knowing. I sent the graded essay back through the portal like every other essay, and I went to bed, and I lay awake for most of the night. The question I had been not asking myself for 4 months was now unavoidable. Not whether to tell her. I was still not certain that was my decision to make, but whether to tell someone, whether to contact the Hartleys and tell them what had happened, that their daughter was in my class, that she had written an essay about her biological mother, that she was wearing the bracelet, that she wanted her biological mother to know she was all right. I called my mother on a Saturday morning. My mother was 64 now and lived in the same house she had always lived in and had, in the years since I had given Lily up, become the person I relied on most to tell me the truth. She listened to the whole story, start to finish, without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does she need?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "I think you do." I thought about it for a long time. I thought about what Lily had written, not what she wanted from her biological mother, which she had been careful not to say, but what she wanted for her. She wanted her to know. She wanted her to know that the bracelet was still on her wrist. She wanted her to have the information that everything was okay. That was what she needed. Not a reunion, not a revelation. The information I wrote to the Hartleys on a Sunday evening. I found an email address through the school directory. James Hartley had a faculty page at the university, where he now taught history. I wrote a careful letter, 3 paragraphs. I told them who I was. I told them that their daughter was in my class, and that I had recognized her, and that I wanted them to know, and that I was not writing to disrupt anything or to ask for anything. I was writing because their daughter had written an essay about her biological mother and had said she wanted her biological mother to know she was all right. And I thought they should know that the biological mother had received that information. I said, "She is remarkable. You have raised a remarkable person. I want you to know that I can see that, and that it means more to me than I have words for." I sent the email, then I sat and looked at the sent folder for a while. Then I closed the laptop. James Hartley responded on Tuesday. His email was longer than I expected. He apologized for the loss of contact. He said they had moved twice in quick succession when Lily was 3, and the agency had lost their updated contact information, and they had assumed the agency had communicated the new address in email. And by the time they realized the communication had broken down, Lily was 5, and they had not known how to reopen a conversation that had gone silent for 2 years. He said, "We never meant to disappear. We have felt guilty about it for years." I read that several times. Not the agency's fault, not a deliberate choice, a logistical failure, a miscommunication, 2 years that became 12 because neither side knew the other was still looking. He asked if I would be willing to meet. Not with Lily, not yet, not without talking to her first, but the two of them, James and Susan, and me. We met at a coffee shop on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks before the end of the semester. I want to say something about what the Hartley's email meant to me, because I think the story of the loss of contact, the 3 letters, the silence, the 12 years is easy to read as a story of deliberate abandonment, and it was not that. It was a logistical failure during a complicated period of their lives, amplified by the agency's inadequacy and by my own reluctance to push harder than I did. Both things are true. They should have tried harder to re-establish contact, and I should have tried harder to find them, and neither of us did, and the 12 years happened. I spent some time in the weeks after James's email sitting with the fact that the silence was not intentional. I had not consciously believed it was intentional. I had told myself repeatedly that the most likely explanation was something systemic, a failure of communication, something that had nothing to do with their feelings about me. But there is a difference between the story you tell yourself and the story you actually believe, and the part of yourself that absorbs things before you can reason about them. And in that deeper place, I had been carrying something that felt like rejection. James's email dissolved that. Not all at once, but over several weeks, like something soluble in water, slowly becoming part of the surrounding instead of separate from it. I also want to say something about the coffee shop meeting, because the 2 hours I spent with James and Susan Hartley in December were among the more unusual experiences of my adult life. In a way I want to try to describe accurately. They knew things about Lily that I did not know. Her favorite book when she was 8. The summer she decided she wanted to be a marine biologist and spent 3 months reading everything about the ocean she could find, and then moved on to something else. The way she cried at the end of movies, not weeping, just a single tear that she was clearly hoping no one would notice. Small specific things, the accumulated specific things of a childhood, things that belonged to the people who were there for it. I knew things about her they did not know. How she held a pen. The specific pause she made before she said something in a discussion. The pause of someone making sure the thought was ready before releasing it. The sentence she had written about loving someone you cannot find. The look she gave me on the last day of class. We were, between the two of us, 2 different parts of the same person's life, and we were sitting at a coffee shop table comparing notes on someone who was not present and who did not yet know we were doing it. I found this simultaneously the strangest and the most necessary thing I had done in years. Susan said, near the end of our conversation, "She has your hands." I looked at her. She said, "I noticed it when she was very young. The way she holds things. It's very specific." I said my grandmother was a pianist. Susan nodded. She said she plays guitar. Self-taught. She just picked it up at 12 and figured it out. I thought about that for a long time afterward. My grandmother's hands, holding guitar strings in a Nashville bedroom, figuring something out. The specific inheritance of a body, traveling forward without knowing it was traveling. They were older than the photographs in my memory, which was obvious and also somehow still surprising. The people in my memory had been frozen at 30-something, and they were now in their late 40s, with the specific gravity that middle age gives to faces that were young and earnest when I had last seen them. Susan cried within the first 5 minutes. James held her hand and looked at the table and then at me. He said, "She doesn't know you're her teacher." I said, "No." He said, "How is she doing in your class?" I said, "She's exceptional. She thinks carefully, she writes beautifully, she's going to do something meaningful with her life." Susan made a sound that I understood completely. We talked for 2 hours, about Lily, who she was, what she was interested in, what her life looked like. About the years of silence, which had been painful for them too, which I had not known and which mattered to understand. About what happened next, which was the question none of us could answer alone, James said. "She has asked about her biological mother more in the last year. She's starting to want to know." Susan said, "We've always been honest with her that the door is open, that if she wants to search when she's older she can, but she hasn't asked to search yet." James said, "I think she's not sure what she wants." I said, "She wrote an essay about what she wants for her biological mother, not what she wants from her. There's a difference." I told them about the essay. I told them what she had written about the bracelet. Susan covered her mouth with her hand. We did not make a decision that day. We agreed to talk again. We agreed that whatever happened, Lily needed to be the one to decide what she wanted, and that none of us were going to make that decision for her. We agreed that the information, that I existed, that I was findable, that I had been her teacher this year, would be given to her when the time was right, and that the right time was for her parents to determine with her, not for me. I drove home from that coffee shop and I sat in my car in my building's parking lot for 15 minutes. Not because I was unable to move, but because I needed to hold everything that had happened in the last 4 months and let it settle into something I could carry going forward. She was all right. She was more than all right. She was exceptional, and she had people who loved her, and she wore the bracelet, and she had written that she thought about me without pain. I had needed to know that for 16 years. I know it now. The semester ended in January, a week after Lily's birthday. Her 16th. I thought about her that morning the way I always thought about her on January 14th, with the specific quality of attention that has no object it can reach. Except this year the object was 3 miles away, blowing out candles in a house I had never been inside, and I knew her face and her hands and her handwriting and the way she pushed up her sleeve when she was thinking. She was not in my class in the spring semester. The schedules rotated and I had different sections. She walked past my classroom sometimes in the hallway, and once she stopped and said, "Hi, Miss Morrison." I said, "Hi, Lily. How's the writing going?" She said, "I'm working on something." I said, "Good, keep going." She smiled and walked on. The Hartleys told her in March. I know this because Susan texted me on a Sunday evening. We told her tonight. She took it quietly. She sat with it for a long time. Then she said, "She was my teacher this whole semester, and she didn't say anything." We said yes, she said, "She was protecting me." We said, "We think so." She didn't say anything else for a while. Then she said, "Can I write to her?" I read that text in my kitchen, standing at the counter, and I put my phone down very carefully on the counter, and I leaned against the wall, and I breathed. Can I write to her? She wrote to me on a Tuesday. An actual letter, handwritten, mailed to the school, addressed to Ms. Kate Morrison. The handwriting was the same handwriting I had been reading on her assignments. All semester, the precise, slightly slanted cursive of someone who takes writing seriously. The letter was 2 pages. She said she had been thinking about what to say for 2 weeks and had not been able to find the right way to start, so she was just starting. She said she understood why I had not told her, and that she had thought about it a lot, and she thought she would have made the same choice. She said she had read back over all of her essays from the fall with the new knowledge, and that the experience was strange and also somehow clarifying. She said, "You wrote in the margins of my personal essay that the sentence about loving someone you cannot find was the best I had written all year. I want you to know that I wrote that sentence thinking about you, and now you have found me, or I have found you, and I'm not sure which one it is, but I think both of them are true." I wrote back the same day. I wrote for an hour and a half, and I threw away 3 drafts. And the final version was 2 pages. I told her about the bracelet, about the craft fair, about the choice I had made and why I had made it, about the 12 years of the open question. I told her that the essay she had written was the most important thing I had read in 9 years of teaching, and I meant it. I told her that I wanted whatever she wanted, contact, or space, or something in between, and that whatever she decided was the right decision, and I would honor it. She wrote back 2 weeks later. She said she needed time, which I understood completely. She said she thought she would like to meet sometime, not soon, but sometime. She said, I still have the bracelet. I know you do, I thought. I have watched it on your wrist all semester. I know you do. That is where we are now. Not in a resolution, not at a reunion. In the in-between, that is where real life actually lives, the space after the discovery and before the knowing, where two people are deciding slowly and carefully how much of each other they want to hold. She is 16. She has a family who loves her and a life that is hers. She has time. She is not in a hurry. And I have been waiting for 16 years. And a little more waiting is something I know how to do. What I know now that I did not know in January when I opened that roster is this. The open question does not close dramatically. It does not resolve in a single moment of recognition or a conversation that explains everything. It opens gradually, the way a room gets light when the sun comes around, not all at once but steadily, from the edges in. She is all right, she told me so herself, in an essay she wrote not knowing who would read it, and the woman who read it had been waiting 16 years to hear it. The bracelet is still on her wrist. If you have ever made a decision you could not undo and spent years wondering who it made you, hear this. The decision was made with everything you had at the time you made it. The person on the other side of it has a life. The life is real and it is good and it is theirs. And sometimes, when everything lines up in a way you could not have planned or predicted, you get to find out. The bracelet is still on her wrist. Drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one.